This is a short story by Guy de Maupassant from a collection translated by Roger Colet. This story is called The Graveyard Sisterhood. The Graveyard Sisterhood. The 5 friends had nearly finished their dinner. They were all rich, middle-aged men of the world, 2 of them bachelors, 3 married men. They met like this once a month, in memory of their younger days, and after dinner chatted until 2 in the morning. These evenings were some of the happiest in their lives, for they had remained close friends and enjoyed one another's company. Their conversation was about anything and everything that interests and amuses Parisians. As in most drawing-rooms, it was a sort of spoken recapitulation of the morning papers. One of the gayest of the 5, Joseph de Bardon, was a bachelor. He lived the Parisian life in the most thorough and whimsical fashion, without being either debauched or depraved. It interested him, and as he was still young, being scarcely 40, he enjoyed it to the full. A man of the world in the widest and best sense of the word, he possessed a great deal of wit without much depth, varied knowledge without real erudition, and quick understanding without serious penetration. And his observations and adventures, his experiences and encounters, furnished him with amusing anecdotes of a comical and philosophical nature, which earned him a considerable reputation in society as an intelligent man. He was the after-dinner speaker of the group, always having a story to tell, which the others looked forward to hearing. He began telling one now, without being asked. Smoking his cigar with his elbows on the table and a half-full glass of liqueur brandy in front of his plate, lulled by the smoky atmosphere, filled with the fragrance of hot coffee, he seemed completely at ease, just as certain beings are completely at ease in certain places and at certain times. A nun in a chapel, for instance, or a goldfish in its bowl. Between 2 puffs of his cigar, he said, "I had a strange adventure a little while ago." The others said with almost a single voice, "Tell us about it." "Gladly," he replied. "You know that I love wandering around Paris, like a collector, peering into shop windows. I, for my part, enjoy watching people and things, everything that's happening and everything that's passing by. Well, about the middle of September, when we were having a spell of very fine weather, I went out one afternoon without knowing where I was going. We men always have a vague desire to call on some pretty woman. We review our gallery of acquaintances. We compare them in our mind. We gauge their relative charms and the interest they arouse in us, and we finally choose the one who attracts us most. But when the sun is shining brightly and the air is warm, we often lose all desire to pay calls. That day the sun was shining brightly and the air was warm, so I just lit a cigar and went for a stroll along the outer boulevard. Then, as I was sauntering along, the idea occurred to me of going to have a look around the Montmartre cemetery. I like cemeteries, you know. They sadden me and soothe my nerves, and I need something to do that. Besides, there are some good friends of mine there, friends nobody goes to see anymore, so I go to see them now and then. As it happens, in that very cemetery, I once buried an old romance, a mistress of mine to whom I was greatly attached, a charming little woman whose memory not only grieves me deeply, but awakens regrets in my heart, all kinds of regrets. I go and dream beside her grave. It's all over for her. I like cemeteries too because they're huge, densely populated cities. Just think of all the bodies in that small space, of the generations of Parisians lodged there forever, troglodytes eternally imprisoned in their little vaults, in little holes covered with a stone or marked by a cross, while the living, fools that they are, take up so much room and make so much noise. Again, in cemeteries you can find monuments that are almost as intriguing as those you find in museums. Though I wouldn't compare the two works, Cavaignac's tomb reminded me of that masterpiece of Jean Goujon's, the statue of Louis de Brezé, in the underground chapel in Rouen Cathedral. Gentlemen, all so-called modern realistic art started there. That statue of the dead Louis de Brezé is more convincing, more terrible, more suggestive of inanimate flesh still convulsed by the death agony than any of the tortured corpses you see on modern tombs. But in Montmartre Cemetery you can still admire the monument to Baudin, which is quite impressive, Gautier's tomb, and Merget's, where the other day I saw a poor solitary wreath of yellow immortelle. Who do you think laid it there? Perhaps the last of the Grisettes, an old woman who has become a concierge in the neighbourhood. It's a pretty little statue by Millet, but spoilt by dirt and neglect. Sing the joys of youth, Merget. So there I was, going into Montmartre Cemetery, and suddenly filled with sadness. A sadness which didn't hurt too much as it happened. The sort of sadness which makes a healthy man think, this isn't a very cheerful place, but at least it isn't time yet for me to come here. The feeling of autumn, that warm dampness, which evokes the idea of dead leaves and tired, anemic sunshine, intensified and poeticized the sense of solitude and finality surrounding that place, which evokes the idea of dead men. I wandered slowly along those streets of tombs, where the neighbours never call on each other, no longer sleep together, and don't read the papers. And I started reading the epitaphs. Let me assure you that nothing in the whole world could be more amusing. Labiche and Mélac have never made me laugh as much as that tombstone prose. Those crosses and marble slabs on which the relatives of the dead had poured out their grief, their wishes for the happiness of the departed in the next world, and their longing to rejoin their loved ones, the hypocrites, make funnier reading than any book by Paul de Kock. But what I love most of all in that cemetery is the deserted, lonely part, planted with great yew trees and cypresses, the old district, inhabited by those who died long ago. For soon it will once again become a new district, and the green trees, nourished by human corpses, will be felled to make room for the recently departed, to be lined up under little marble slabs. After I had wandered about long enough to refresh my mind, I realized that I was in danger of getting bored, and that it was time for me to go to the last bed of my sometime mistress and pay her the faithful tribute of my memory. My heart was heavy as I reached her grave. The poor darling was so sweet and loving, so fair and lovely, and now, if her grave were opened... Bending over the iron railing, I whispered a few sorrowful words to her, which she probably never heard, and I was about to walk away when I saw a woman in deep mourning, kneeling down in front of the next grave. Her crape veil had been thrown back to reveal a pretty head of fair hair, which looked like a bright dawn under the dark night of her headdress. I stayed where I was. She was obviously in the grip of profound sorrow. She had buried her face in her hands and was deep in meditation, holding herself as rigid as a statue. Absorbed in her grief, and telling the painful beads of memory behind her closed and hidden eyes, she seemed herself like a corpse, mourning a corpse. Then, all of a sudden, from a slight movement of her back, like a willow stirring in the wind, I guessed that she was going to cry. She wept gently at first, then more violently, her neck and shoulders shaking. Suddenly she uncovered her eyes. They were full of tears and quite charming. She looked around her frantically, as if awakening from a nightmare. She saw me gazing at her, looked embarrassed, and hid her face again in her hands. Then she burst into convulsive sobs, and her head slowly bent towards the marble tombstone. She rested her forehead on it, and her veil, falling around her, covered the white corners of the beloved sepulchre like a new mourning cloth. I heard her moan, and then she collapsed with her cheek against the tombstone and lay there motionless and unconscious. I rushed over to her, slapped her hands and breathed on her eyelids, at the same time reading the simple epitaph on the tombstone. Here lies Louis Theodore Carrel, captain in the Marine Light Infantry, killed by the enemy in Tonkin. Pray for his soul. This death had only occurred a few months earlier. I was moved to tears, and I redoubled my efforts to revive her. At last they succeeded, and she came to. I'm not a bad-looking fellow. I'm not yet 40, and at that moment I looked extremely upset. I realised from her first glance that she was likely to be polite and grateful. I was not disappointed, and between further tears and sobs, she told me about the officer who had been killed in Tonkin after they'd been married only a year. He had married her for love, as she was an orphan and possessed nothing but her dowry. I consoled her, comforted her, lifted her up and helped her to her feet. Then I said, "You can't stay here. Come along." "I'm incapable of walking," she murmured. "Let me help you." "Thank you, monsieur. You are very kind. Did you come here to mourn someone?" "Yes, madame." "Your wife?" "A mistress." "A man may love a mistress as much as a wife, for passion knows no law." "Yes, madame," I replied. And we walked away together, she leaning on me, and I almost carrying her along the alleys. As we left the cemetery, she murmured, "I think I'm going to faint." "Would you like to go somewhere and take something to revive you?" "Yes, monsieur." I noticed a restaurant nearby, one of those restaurants where the friends of the dead go to celebrate at the end of their mournful duty. We went in, and I made her drink a cup of hot tea, which seemed to restore her strength. A faint smile came to her lips, and she started telling me about herself. It was so sad, she said, to be all alone in the world, to be alone at home day and night, to have nobody any more to whom she could give her love, trust and intimacy. This all seemed sincere and sounded well on her lips. I felt my heart softening. She was very young, perhaps 20. I paid her a few compliments, which she accepted gracefully. Then, as it was getting late, I offered to take her home in a cab. She accepted. In the cab we were so close to each other that we could feel the warmth of our bodies through our clothes, which is really the most disturbing thing in the world. When the cab drew up in front of her house, she murmured, "I don't feel capable of walking upstairs by myself, for I live on the 4th floor. You have already been so kind to me. Will you give me your arm as far as my apartment?" I gladly agreed. She walked up slowly, breathing hard. Then, outside her door, she added, "Do come in for a few minutes, so that I can thank you." And I went in. Her apartment was modest, even rather poor, but simply and tastefully furnished. We sat down side by side on a little sofa, and she began talking to me again about her loneliness. She rang for her maid to offer me a drink, but the girl didn't come. I was delighted, concluding that this maid probably came only in the morning and was really just a cleaning woman. She had taken off her hat. She was so charming with her limpid eyes fixed upon me, so clear and steady, that I was seized by a terrible temptation, to which I succumbed. I clasped her in my arms and kissed her again and again on her eyelids, which she had promptly lowered. She struggled to free herself, pushing me away and repeating, "Please, please, Please! What did she mean by that word? In such circumstances, please could have two meanings. To silence her, I passed from her eyes to her lips and gave the word please the conclusion I preferred. She didn't resist overmuch, and when we looked at each other again after this insult to the memory of the captain killed in Tonkin, she had a languorous expression of tender resignation which dispelled my misgivings. I showed my gratitude by being gallant and attentive. After further conversation lasting about an hour, I asked her, "Where do you usually dine?" "In a little restaurant near here." "All alone?" "Why, yes." "Will you have dinner with me?" "Where?" "In a good restaurant on the boulevard." She demurred, but I insisted, and she finally gave way, consoling herself with the argument that she was bored and lonely. Then she added, "I must put on a dress that isn't so dark." She went into her bedroom, and when she came out, she was in half mourning, wearing a very simple grey dress, which made her look slim and charming. She obviously had different outfits for town and cemetery. Dinner was very pleasant. She drank some champagne and became very animated and lively. I went back to her apartment with her. This liaison, begun among the tombstones, lasted about 3 weeks. But men grow tired of everything, and especially of women. I left her on the pretext of an unavoidable journey. I was very generous when we parted, and she was very grateful. She made me promise and even swear that I would come back on my return to Paris, for she really seemed to care for me a little. I lost no time in forming other attachments, and about a month went by without the temptation to resume that funereal affair becoming strong enough for me to yield to it. However, I had not forgotten her. The memory of her haunted me like a mystery, a psychological problem, one of those inexplicable questions which nag at you for an answer. I don't know why, but one day it occurred to me that I might find her in the Montmartre cemetery, so I went back there. I walked around for a long time without meeting anyone but the usual visitors to the place, mourners who had not yet broken off all relations with their dead. The tomb of the captain killed in Tonkin had no weeping woman kneeling beside it, and no flowers or wreaths on the marble slab. But as I was walking through another district of that great city of the dead, I suddenly saw a couple in deep mourning coming towards me down a narrow avenue filled with crosses. To my amazement, when they drew near, I recognized her. She saw me and blushed. As I brushed past her, she gave me a little signal, a little glance which meant, "Don't recognize me," but which also seemed to say, "Come back and see me, darling." The man with her was about 50 years old, distinguished and well dressed, with the rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honor, and he was supporting her, just as I had supported her when we had left the cemetery together. I went off dumbfounded, puzzling over what I had just seen, and wondering to what race of creatures that graveyard huntress belonged. Was she just an ordinary whore, an inspired prostitute who visited graveyards to pick up unhappy men haunted by the loss of a wife or mistress and troubled by the memory of past caresses? Was she unique, or were there several like her? Was it a profession, a graveyard sisterhood who walked the cemeteries as others walked the streets? Or had she alone hit upon that admirable idea, that profoundly philosophical notion of exploiting the amorous regrets awakened in those mournful places? I would have dearly loved to know whose widow she had chosen to be that day. The end.